There is a parking lot at the corner of First Street and Central Avenue in Albuquerque, New Mexico. It is a flat, unremarkable piece of gravel where nothing happens. For most of the 20th century, it was the most important address in the state, a 120-room hotel so beautiful that one traveler called it the most beautiful of them all, with old gray stucco and turquoise trim, its cool courts and shady patios inviting siesta. The Alvarado Hotel was the social heart of Albuquerque, the place where governors held court, where the annual Montezuma Ball drew every family of consequence in New Mexico, where travelers, stepping off the train, found themselves in a building that announced, "This city matters." In 1970, the Santa Fe Railway demolished it and replaced it with gravel. That story, a city that builds something extraordinary and then destroys it, is the story of Albuquerque. But it goes deeper than that. Because Albuquerque did not fall from grace. It was never in grace to begin with. Its first town marshal was a serial killer. Its red light district operated with the blessing of city government for 34 years. Its largest employer makes nuclear weapons. Its most famous cultural contribution to the 21st century is a television show about cooking methamphetamine. This is a city where lawlessness is not a chapter in the story. It is the story, and it has been from the very first day. The settlement that would become Albuquerque was founded in 1706 by Governor Francisco Cuervo y Valdez, a Spanish colonial administrator who named it after the Duke of Albuquerque, Viceroy of New Spain. There was an extra R in it back then, which has since been lost. The first of many things Albuquerque would casually discard. For a century and a half, it was a small farming village on the Rio Grande, adobe houses clustered around a plaza, a church, cottonwood trees along the river. Unremarkable. If the railroad had never come, you would never have heard of it. But the railroad came. On April 10, 1880, the tracks of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway reached Albuquerque. 5 days later, a freight train pulled in without fanfare. On April 22nd, a trainload of dignitaries arrived from Santa Fe, and there were parades and music from the 9th Cavalry Band and fireworks. But here is the detail that tells you everything about Albuquerque. The railroad did not come to Albuquerque. It came near Albuquerque. The New Mexico Town Company, a subsidiary of the railroad, had originally planned to run the line through Bernalillo, a few miles north. When the land there proved too expensive, they bought cheaper acreage 1 mile east of Old Town Albuquerque and platted an entirely new settlement around the tracks. They called it Newtown. They sold plots to eager buyers who wanted to be close to the tracks, and the money flowed to the railroad company, not to the people who had been living in the original town for 174 years. So from its first modern breath, Albuquerque was a city that existed because someone wanted to save money on real estate. Old Town, the original 174-year-old village with its plaza and its church, was instantly obsolete. Businesses migrated to the tracks. Stores and saloons sprouted along the railroad in tents and hastily built shacks. A trolley line eventually connected Old Town to Newtown, a mile of track linking a place people lived to a place where money was being made. Newtown grew, Old Town withered. The county courthouse moved away in 1926, stripping it of whatever administrative significance it had left. It would not be formally annexed by the city until 1949. Before that, it did not even have paved streets. What Newtown had in abundance was chaos. The first marshal of Albuquerque was a man named Milton J. Yarberry, though that was not his real name. He had been born John Armstrong in Arkansas around 1849, and by the time he arrived in New Mexico, he had killed at least 5 men, owned 3 saloons and a brothel, played the violin, ridden with the Texas Rangers, and run off with his business partner's wife. He befriended Bernalillo County Sheriff Perfecto Armijo, and with Armijo's backing was appointed Albuquerque's first town marshal in 1880. Essentially, the Merchants Association hired him so the community could have law enforcement without paying taxes for it. It was not much of a bargain. Within months, Yarberry shot and killed a man named Harry Brown in a dispute over a woman. He was acquitted on a self-defense claim. Barely a month later, still on the job, he shot and killed Charles Campbell, an unarmed man he claimed had drawn on him during a confrontation on the street. No gun was found on Campbell. Yarberry had shot him 3 times, twice in the back. This time, the jury was not persuaded. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to hang. He escaped from the Santa Fe jail, was recaptured 3 days later, and on February 9, 1883, was hanged at the Bernalillo County Jail on an innovative gallows designed from plans published in Scientific American that jerked the condemned upward instead of dropping him through a trap door. The sheriff assigned to pull the lever was Perfecto Armijo, the same man who had recruited Yarberry for the job. Tickets were sold. Yarberry's last words were, "Gentlemen, you are hanging an innocent man." Think about that for a moment. A city's very first lawman, the man hired specifically to impose order, turned out to be the most dangerous person in town. The sheriff who gave him the job was forced to execute him, and the whole affair was treated as entertainment, tickets for sale, a Scientific American gadget for the killing. Albuquerque was less than 3 years old as a modern city, and it had already established a pattern that would repeat for the next century and a half. Bring in something meant to fix the problem, watch it become the problem. The city Yarberry left behind was not exactly bereft of sin in his absence. Albuquerque's red light district, clustered around the railroad tracks in the heart of Newtown, was known as Hell's Half Acre. Prostitution in Albuquerque was legal from 1880 to 1914, 34 years, during which the sex trade operated openly and without meaningful interference. A brothel owner named Lizzie McGrath had a local church demolished to make room for her new bordello. The Swastika Saloon, the name referenced a Native American symbol, then common in New Mexico, billed itself as a dance hall with a wine room in connection, which was code for a brothel. The Red Light Saloon did not bother with code at all. Albuquerque's early lawless reputation, as one local historian put it, rivaled that of Dodge City and Tombstone. The difference is that Dodge City and Tombstone cleaned up. Albuquerque found new ways to keep the tradition alive. But first, it tried to become something better. In the 1890s, the Albuquerque Commercial Club, the precursor to the Chamber of Commerce, looked at the dry, high desert air and saw an opportunity. Tuberculosis was the leading cause of death in the United States, and there was no cure. The only treatment available was rest, sunshine, and elevation, and Albuquerque had all 3. The Commercial Club began marketing the city to Eastern Americans as the heart of the well country, courting the sick and the desperate. They came by the thousands, riding the railroad into the desert with their ruined lungs, chasing the cure. They were called lungers. The strategy worked almost too well. They came from Boston, from New York, from Chicago, pale, thin, coughing into handkerchiefs, dragging steamer trunks into the desert sun. Some could afford the sanitariums. Others slept in tents on the mesa or rented rooms in boarding houses and simply sat outside breathing. A 1918 public health survey estimated that roughly 50% of Albuquerque's population either had tuberculosis or were family members of consumptives. 90% were not native to the city. Albuquerque had essentially become a city of the dying. It had staked its economic future on an illness, and the illness had obliged. Sanitariums opened one after another: St. Joseph's, the Methodist Deaconess, Lawless Sanatorium, Hillcrest. New Mexico offered tax breaks for their construction. By 1908, the state ranked 5th in the nation for the number of sanatoriums. It was an industry, and like all industries, it reshaped the city around itself. The Lovelace hospitals, which would grow into one of Albuquerque's major medical institutions, began as a tuberculosis clinic. The sick people who survived often stayed, bringing their skills and their ambitions. The Lunger's legacy is the foundation of Albuquerque's modern healthcare system. It is also a parable about what happens when a city's entire economy depends on one thing, in this case, the continued existence of an incurable disease. While the tuberculosis industry was drawing invalids from the east, the city was also trying to look like a place worth coming to for reasons other than dying. On May 11, 1902, the Alvarado Hotel opened its doors at the corner of 1st Street and Central Avenue, directly adjacent to the railroad depot. Built at a cost borne entirely by the railroad, it was designed by Charles Frederick Whittlesey, the Santa Fe's own architect, in the California Mission Revival style. Curved gables, stucco arcades, a long, low silhouette that married elegance to the landscape. It was a Fred Harvey hotel, part of the famous chain that revolutionized travel dining across the American West, and its interior was designed by Mary J. Coulter, who filled the rooms with regional artifacts and Native American motifs. With 120 guest rooms, the Alvarado was the largest Harvey house in the system. Local businessmen expected the hotel would attract the wealthier classes to stop in Albuquerque on their travels to the west. They were right. For decades, the Alvarado was the most important building in the city, and arguably in the state. 21 years later, a second grand hotel opened 5 blocks west. The Franciscan Hotel, designed by the El Paso firm of Trost and Trost in the Pueblo Revival style, rose 6 stories at the corner of 6th and Central, a remarkable height for the city and the era. It had been funded by the community itself. The local Chamber of Commerce and the Kiwanis Club organized a drive that raised roughly $350,000, about $6.3 million in today's money, to build a hotel they believed would put Albuquerque on the map. It opened on December 15, 1923, and its postcard promised guests that the courtesy, thoughtfulness, and helpfulness in catering to the comforts of guests make this hotel more home-like than hotel-like. 4 years later, an Italian immigrant named Oreste Bacecchi, who had arrived in the United States in 1885 and set up his first business in a tent near the railroad tracks, opened the Chemo Theater at the corner of 5th and Central. Bacecchi had risen from tent merchant to liquor dealer to proprietor of the Savoy Hotel. The Chemo, designed by the Bowler brothers in a style now called Pueblo Deco, cost $150,000 and was unlike anything else in the country. A movie palace whose chandeliers, staircases, and murals drew on Pueblo and Navajo artistic traditions. The name came from the Isleta Pueblo language, Chemo, meaning king of its kind. A tent merchant's son built a palace. It was, in its way, the most American story imaginable. So picture Central Avenue in, say, 1928. You are standing on the most important street in New Mexico. To your east, the Alvarado Hotel presides over the railroad depot. To your west, the Franciscan Hotel rises against the sky. Between them, the Chemo Theater blazes with light. The sidewalks are crowded. The stores are open. Sears and Roebuck, J.C. Penney, Woolworths, Kresge's, Mindland's Jewelry, the Court Cafe and Bakery. Albuquerque has roughly 26,000 people, and every one of them who wants anything comes here. Central Avenue is the spine. Then, in 1926, it became something more. That year, the federal government designated U.S. Route 66, the highway that would connect Chicago to Los Angeles across 2,400 miles of the American heartland. It ran right through Albuquerque. Originally, the route followed 4th Street, running north-south. But in 1937, it was realigned to run east-west along Central Avenue. The effect was transformative. Albuquerque was no longer just a railroad town. It was a road town, an oasis for the millions of Americans who were now driving west. Motels materialized along Central like a neon fever dream. The Tiwa Motor Lodge opened in 1946 in the Pueblo Revival style. La Puerta Motor Lodge, built in 1949, was the first motel travelers encountered driving in from the east, so its name, the Door, made perfect sense. The Dianza, the Alvarado, the Luna Lodge, the Nod a While. Each one had a sign taller and brighter than the last, competing for the attention of drivers who'd been staring at desert for hours. 3 of these motels were listed in the Negro Motorist Green Book, Victor H. Green's Guide to Safe Lodging for Black Travelers, a reminder that the romance of Route 66 was not equally distributed. After wartime rationing and travel restrictions ended in 1945, Americans took to the road in numbers the country had never seen, and Route 66 entered what the National Park Service would later call its golden age. Central Avenue was the midpoint of a continent. Families in Chevrolets and Fords, loaded with luggage and children, rolled through Albuquerque at all hours, and the motels competed for their attention with signs that rose 30 and 40 feet above the pavement. Arrows of red and blue neon, cowboys on horseback, cacti outlined in green light, names that promised rest to people who had been driving across the desert since dawn. The money that came through was not factory money or government money. It was road money. $5 a night for a room, $1.50 for a steak dinner, a quarter for gas. Multiplied by millions of travelers over 2 decades, it sustained a commercial corridor that stretched 18 miles across the city. Central Avenue was a cash register that never closed. But by the time the neon signs reached their full blaze, a different kind of energy was arriving in Albuquerque, one that would change the city more profoundly than the railroad, the Lungers, or Route 66 combined. In January 1941, construction began on the Albuquerque Army Air Base, which would be renamed Kirtland Field after early military pilot Colonel Roy C. Kirtland. During the war, it served as a major training installation. But in July 1945, something far more consequential happened. The Manhattan Project's Z Division, the engineering arm responsible for designing, testing, and assembling the non-nuclear components of atomic weapons, was relocated from the increasingly crowded Los Alamos laboratory to a site adjacent to Kirtland Field. Los Alamos had invented the bomb. Albuquerque would build it. The impact on the city was instantaneous and staggering. In 1940, Albuquerque's population was 35,449. Still, after all those decades, a small city. By 1950, it was 96,815, nearly tripled in a single decade, the fastest growth rate in its history, more than 10% per year. By 1960, it had doubled again to 201,189. The 1950s alone added over 104,000 people, more than Albuquerque's entire population had been at the start of the decade. Nothing in the city's history, not the railroad, not the Lungers, had produced growth like this. Federal money poured in. Subdivisions sprawled east and northeast across the mesa. Builders like Dale Bellama and Mossman Gladden put up tract homes by the hundreds on land that had been vacant desert just months before. The city was no longer a railroad town or a health resort or a highway oasis. It was a nuclear city, and the nuclear city needed workers, houses, schools, highways, and shopping centers. Z Division became Sandia National Laboratories on November 1, 1949, at the request of President Harry Truman. Today, Sandia's Albuquerque campus sprawls across nearly 21 square miles within Kirtland Air Force Base, an installation that is now the 3rd largest in Air Force Global Strike Command. In 1992, the Kirtland Underground Munitions Storage Complex was activated on the base. It is believed to be the largest repository of nuclear warheads on Earth, housing an estimated 2,500 weapons. This is a city with nuclear warheads stored on its outskirts and a crime rate that ranks among the worst in the nation. Sandia employs roughly 14,000 people. The base payroll and the laboratory contracts are the largest single source of economic activity in the metro area. The people who design the country's nuclear deterrent drive to work past neighborhoods where the car theft rate is the highest in America. The incongruity barely registers anymore. It is just Albuquerque. And then there is the matter of the hydrogen bomb that Albuquerque accidentally dropped on itself. On May 22, 1957, a B-36 Peacemaker bomber was on approach to Kirtland Air Force Base at an altitude of 1,700 feet. In its rear bomb bay sat a Mark 17 hydrogen bomb, the largest thermonuclear weapon ever deployed by the United States. It was 24 feet long, weighed 42,000 pounds, and had a design yield of 15 to 20 megatons, roughly 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. The Mark 17 was being transported from Texas to have its fusing system replaced. For safety, the plutonium core had been removed and stored separately on the aircraft. As the bomber descended, the bomb broke free. It fell through the closed bomb bay doors and plummeted into the desert 5 miles south of the Albuquerque airport. Without its plutonium core, a nuclear detonation was impossible. But the Mark 17 still contained 300 pounds of conventional explosives in its primary trigger, and the impact set them off. The blast blew a crater 25 feet wide and 12 feet deep, scattering debris and low-level radioactive contamination over a mile-wide radius. The land belonged to the University of New Mexico. Its only occupants were cattle. The story was classified for nearly 30 years. Most Albuquerque residents had no idea it had happened. A city that stored the world's nuclear arsenal had almost been destroyed by one of its own weapons, and nobody told them. By the time the hydrogen bomb story was declassified, the city had already committed a different kind of destruction, one it carried out deliberately, with federal money and the best of intentions. From the early 1950s to the mid-1960s, downtown Albuquerque on Central, from Broadway to First Street, was the hub, the place where you shopped, banked, ate, and saw a movie. H. Cook's Sporting Goods, Stromberg's Clothing, Fogg's Fine Jewelry, Franchini's Deli, the Sunshine and State and El Rey movie theaters. It was a real downtown, the kind where you could walk 6 blocks and accomplish everything you needed for the week. Then the suburban expansion of the 1950s began to drain the life from it. In March 1961, Winrock Shopping Center opened along Louisiana Boulevard and Interstate 40, and the effect was devastating. National retailers, Sears, J.C. Penney, Montgomery Ward, followed their customers to the malls. Downtown retail volume plummeted to 1/8 of what it had been 30 years earlier. Theaters closed. Restaurants closed. The Central Business District, once crowded and alive, became a place that essentially shut down at 4:30 every afternoon when the government workers went home and did not reopen until 8 o'clock the next morning. The federal government's answer to this national pattern was urban renewal, a program that in city after city demolished the old to make room for the new. Albuquerque was a late adopter, but when it finally embraced the concept, it did so with devastating thoroughness. The Tijeras Urban Renewal Project, launched in 1968 with $25 to $28 million in federal funding, demolished block after block between Tijeras Avenue and Lomas Boulevard, from 2nd Street to 6th Street, 182 acres in the heart of the city. Historic buildings fell one after another, replaced by a convention center, a civic plaza, office towers, and surface parking lots. The property tax revenue in the affected area reportedly increased tenfold. The character of the area was obliterated. And then the hotels. On January 2, 1970, the Alvarado Hotel closed its doors for the last time. The Santa Fe Railway, which owned the building, had announced the closure in September 1969 and offered to sell the property to the city. The asking price was $1.5 million, and the city balked. Pete V. Domenici, then chairman of the Albuquerque City Commission, later a United States Senator, requested a demolition delay to determine whether the hotel could be incorporated into downtown renewal plans. The Albuquerque Goals Committee stressed that the Alvarado was not only the heart and focus of Railroad Albuquerque, but also an indispensable architectural source for the unique sense of place which Albuquerque has inherited. The State Planning Office wrote to the president of the Santa Fe Railway urging preservation. About 200 citizens attended a public meeting. There were speeches and petition drives and an evening march. None of it mattered. On February 2nd, 1970, wrecking crews began removing doors and windows. By March 15th, the central section of the hotel, the building that had been the social and political center of the city for nearly 70 years, crumbled under the wrecking ball. On February 17th, the City Commission deferred indefinitely a proposed historic zone ordinance for the Alvarado complex. One observer noted that it was apparent that the citizens of Albuquerque didn't really care. The Franciscan Hotel, 5 blocks west, closed in October 1970 and was demolished between May and July of 1972. The $350,000 building that the community had raised the money to construct, the building designed by Trost and Trost, the 7-story Pueblo Revival landmark at 6th and Central, was gone. In its place, another parking lot. The Chemo Theater, the Pueblo Deco Palace that Oreste Bacecchi had built for $150,000 in 1927, came close to the same fate. It closed in the late 1960s, was briefly leased for live theater, and then started showing adult films. By 1977, a fire had left it in severe disrepair, and the city offered the Bacecchi family a choice: sell at a fraction of its value or have the building condemned and demolished. The family sold. It was the citizens who saved the Chemo, voting to purchase it, then funding a restoration that was completed in 2000. It remains open today, the only one of downtown's 3 great landmarks that survived. Now that the Alvarado and the Franciscan are gone, it dominates its block. There is nothing left to compete with. The void left by urban renewal filled predictably. As one historian described it, the optimism of the 1960s renewal schemes curdled, leaving half-raised blocks and parking lots where old hotels had stood. What moved in were the businesses that could afford the rent in a place nobody wanted to be: X-rated cinemas, adult bookstores, bail bond offices, liquor stores. The pornography marquees arrived after the decline, a symptom rather than a cause. Central Avenue, the street that had been the spine of the city, became a synonym for trouble. Meanwhile, the interstate highway system delivered a second blow. I-40, the highway that would eventually replace Route 66, was under construction through Albuquerque during the 1960s. When it was completed, it did exactly what interstates do everywhere. It routed traffic around the old commercial corridor rather than through it. The motels along Central, the Tiwa, the Luna Lodge, the Not a While, lost the river of travelers that had been their lifeblood. Route 66 was officially decommissioned as a federal highway in 1985. Some of the old motels adapted, many did not. The Not a While is now the parking lot of a Pep Boys. It is easy from a distance to call this tragedy, but it is also worth noting how much of it was chosen. The city chose to defer the historic zone ordinance. The railway chose to demolish the Alvarado rather than sell it for less than $1.5 million. The city chose to raise 182 acres of downtown rather than renovate it. The city chose suburban expansion over urban maintenance. At every decision point, someone looked at what Albuquerque was and decided it was worth less than what Albuquerque might become. The old buildings, the old streets, the old patterns, they were liabilities, not assets. Every generation dismantled what the previous one had built. And through all of it, the lawlessness persisted. In 2014, the United States Department of Justice concluded an investigation into the Albuquerque Police Department. The findings were damning. Federal investigators determined that APD officers engaged in a pattern of excessive force, including deadly force, in violation of the Fourth Amendment. They reviewed 20 officer-involved fatal shootings over a 4-year period and concluded that a majority were unconstitutional. A significant amount of the force was directed at people with mental illness. In the years leading up to the investigation, the city had paid out more than $23 million in settlements and court judgments in civil rights cases brought by the families of people killed or injured by police. The DOJ's findings were released on April 10, 2014, just weeks after protests erupted over the shooting of James Boyd, a homeless man with mental illness who was killed by officers because he was camping illegally. The ensuing consent decree contained nearly 300 paragraphs of mandated reforms and placed the department under the supervision of a federal judge and an independent monitor. It took more than a decade and cost the city over $40 million before federal oversight was finally lifted in May 2025. The department that was supposed to enforce the law had itself been found to be breaking it. The crime that the reformed police department was meant to combat showed no signs of relenting. In 2016, the Albuquerque metropolitan area was ranked #1 in the nation for automobile theft by the National Insurance Crime Bureau, with more than 10,000 vehicles reported stolen. The city held the top position for 3 consecutive years. The reasons offered included chronic police understaffing. The department had dropped from over 1,000 officers to around 864 by 2015, high recidivism rates, and a population struggling with poverty and addiction. By 2017, the city had its highest homicide count in 20 years. By 2022, Albuquerque set an all-time record, 120 homicides in a single year, up from 110 the year before. Non-fatal shootings remained stubbornly high. Drug offenses spiked by 154% in 2023, driven largely by fentanyl trafficking and what police called much more aggressive enforcement of low-level possession. The violent crime rate sits at roughly 51 per 1,000 residents, more than double the national average. Your chance of being a victim of some crime in Albuquerque is 1 in 17. The human texture of these numbers is relentless. A 74-year-old man named Bob Higginson had his wallet, phone, and car keys stolen from an unlocked locker at a public swimming pool in August 2017. His Mazda station wagon was gone from the parking lot. He filed a police report, then went looking for the car himself. His daughter posted the theft on Facebook. Someone spotted the car at an apartment complex, and Higginson drove over and called police. They never showed up. The suspects, when they were eventually caught, had been in jail 5 days earlier on another car theft charge. Both had been released without bond. This was not an unusual story. It was so ordinary that it ran as a local news item, a single data point in a river of data points. The people of Albuquerque had learned to live in a city where calling the police and receiving no response was a realistic possibility. And then there is Breaking Bad. The AMC television series, which aired from 2008 to 2013, was set and filmed in Albuquerque, and it made the city more famous than anything since Route 66. The show follows a high school chemistry teacher who becomes a methamphetamine kingpin, and it turned ordinary Albuquerque locations, a fast food burrito chain, a car wash, a suburban ranch house, into international tourist destinations. The Albuquerque Convention and Visitors Bureau created a website mapping the show's filming locations. ABQ Trolley Company sold out Breaking Bad tours at $60 a ticket. A donut shop sold pastries topped with blue candy designed to resemble crystal meth. The state legislature passed what became known as the Breaking Bad Bill, offering tax breaks to television productions that filmed in New Mexico. Tourism officials were careful to note that they were walking a fine line, profiting from a show that centered on drug trafficking, addiction, and violence. Exactly the things that were making the real Albuquerque unlivable. But the money was good, and the visibility was better. The show's creator, Vince Gilligan, has said he chose Albuquerque largely for the production tax incentives and the light. But there is something fitting about the choice that goes beyond economics. Breaking Bad is, at its heart, a story about a place where the normal rules have broken down, where a middle-class man can become a drug lord because the systems that should stop him are too weak, too corrupt, or too indifferent to intervene. That is not a story you can set just anywhere. You need a city where the gap between the official version and the street-level reality is wide enough to build an empire in. You need a city where lawlessness feels plausible. You need Albuquerque. The numbers today tell a story that would have been familiar to Milt Yarberry. The city's population sits around 560,000, roughly flat since 2020, with growth rates among the lowest in its modern history. The metro area approaches 1 million. Albuquerque is still the largest city in New Mexico, still the home of Sandia National Laboratories and Kirtland Air Force Base, still a place where federal defense spending forms the backbone of the economy. The University of New Mexico anchors the Central Corridor. The balloon fiesta, held every October, draws hundreds of thousands of visitors to watch hot air balloons rise over the Rio Grande Valley against the Sandia Mountains. The mountains themselves turn pink at sunset. Sandia means watermelon in Spanish, and the light at dusk is genuinely extraordinary. People come to Albuquerque for the light and stay for the cost of living, which remains lower than most western cities. There is a reason the city still attracts residents even as the crime statistics repel them. But the old Central Avenue, the street that was once the commercial spine of the city and the main artery of Route 66, tells the truer story. Some of the neon signs still burn. The doghouse, featured in both Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, still wags its electric tail over the sidewalk. The De Anza Motor Lodge, one of only 3 Albuquerque motels listed in the Negro Motorist Green Book, survives as an apartment complex. The Alvarado, shuttered for years, has been renovated into a boutique hotel. Friends of the Orphan Signs, a local preservation group, works to restore and reactivate historic signs that have gone dark. In late 2023, Albuquerque received a National Park Service grant to help preserve its 18-mile stretch of urban Route 66. There are people fighting for the street, trying to bring back what was lost. But much of what was lost cannot be brought back, because it was not lost, it was demolished. The decisions were made by identifiable people at identifiable moments, and the consequences were permanent. The Alvarado did not burn down. It did not collapse from neglect. A railroad company chose to destroy it rather than sell it at a price the city could afford, and the city chose to let it happen. The Franciscan did not crumble. A community that had raised $350,000 to build it watched it fall for the price of a parking lot. These were not accidents. They were transactions. The site of the Alvarado Hotel is now occupied by the Alvarado Transportation Center, a modern transit hub that opened in 2002, exactly a century after the original hotel. It was designed to echo the Mission Revival style of the building it replaced. It is a well-intentioned tribute. It is also a building that exists because the original is gone, and it is not the same thing. You cannot demolish a city's memory and then rebuild it from a photograph. Central Avenue runs 18 miles through Albuquerque, east to west, from the mouth of Tijeras Canyon to the lava cliffs of the western mesa. Along its length, you can still read the history of the city like sediment in a canyon wall, the Pueblo deco of the Quimo, the neon arrows of the Tewa, the mid-century concrete of the motels that survived, the blank faces of the parking lots where the landmarks used to be. At night, the remaining neon signs flicker on, and for a few hours, Central Avenue looks the way it looked in the photographs. Warm, bright, alive with the suggestion that something interesting is happening just ahead. On the corner of First and Central, where the Alvarado once stood, the light turns green and the traffic moves through.